And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ellen Schenk, and I am the Community Engagement Librarian for the State Library. Thanks for joining us today for the first of several State Library Rare Collection virtual open house events. This event is being recorded and will be available through our website after the talk. The State Library Rare Collections Room and Vault are housed in the historic Forum Building in downtown Harrisburg, which is undergoing extensive renovations. We have a temporary library in the Keystone Building in downtown Harrisburg that is now closed to the public due to COVID. We hope to be reopening in summer of 2021. We invite you to visit when conditions are safe for us to be together again. While the library is closed, we are offering reference services over the phone or by email, and contact information is on our website. We will be offering virtual programs throughout 2021, so check our website for events throughout the year. Today, I'd like to introduce Michael Lear, the State Library Rare Collections Librarian, as he delves into topics on book preservation and history during virtual lunch and learn presentations over the course of this year. Each session will highlight an aspect of items preserved within the vaults of the State Library. Michael Lear became the Rare Collections Librarian at the State Library in September 2019, after 20 years at Franklin Marshall College Libraries, Archives, and Special Collections, where he organized, cataloged, and digitized materials and assisted students, faculty, staff, alumni, and the public in accessing collections. With a lifelong interest in history and material culture, Mr. Lear holds a master's in history and museum studies from the University of Delaware and a master's in library science from Clarion University. Today, we are learning about publishers' bindings. This session features a discussion on the end of the hand binding era and the emergence of publisher-designed and produced edition bindings in the early 19th century. Michael will discuss the evolution of styles and methods used to produce 19th century publishers' bindings between 1830 and 1930. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Lear.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, sounds good.
We tested that before, but make sure.
Yeah.
So welcome to the State Library of Pennsylvania. As Ellen said, I'm Michael Lear, Rare Collections Librarian. This year, I'll be joining the Lunch and Learns on a quarterly basis. My next appearance will probably be April or May. Ellen will announce more about that later. And so today, as she mentioned, I'll be talking about American publishers' bindings in the 19th century to the early 20th centuries, using representative examples from the rare collections. So first of all, what is a publisher's binding? It is a binding for a book issued in a large quantity, commercially produced. It is a binding selected by a publisher and produced at publisher's expense. It is a binding made of uniform materials with identical appearance throughout copies. So some key concepts that I hope to convey today. Let me close my window here so I can see the slide. Some key concepts I hope to convey today are the differences between hand bindings and publishers or edition bindings, custom versus trade style bindings, decorated bindings versus publishers illustrated bindings, and various developments and trends through time. So to give you a little bit of background, so to better understand publishers' bindings, I feel we need to give a little bit of background on the era that immediately preceded the publishers' binding era, the hand binding era. This occurred before the 1820s largely, where it was an era where binding, bookselling, and printing were separate trades. There wasn't a consolidation into a publishing industry as such yet at that time. The publisher could be the bookseller, usually the bookseller, the printer, an author, or another party. The consumer could purchase unbound books in sheets, wrappers, or limited numbers were pre-bound in a trade style. The publisher was reluctant to invest too much capital in books at this time, so they did not uniformly put bindings on books, but the bookseller might bind a couple books for the walk-in trade, but usually the consumer purchased purchase an unbound book, and then they custom chose what type of binding, if any, they wanted to have on it. So bindings, in that way, bindings could be customized based on taste, the value given toward books, and the price the consumer was willing to pay. So as such, you don't see a lot of consistency in bindings in 18th century books because it was largely custom. The bindings at this time were mostly leather-based. There were some popular binding styles throughout time and throughout whatever region they were bound, where they were bound. Bindings could also be decorated by tooling or by leather treatments. So here's an example of how you usually purchased a book in a plain, if it had any cover at all on it, you could purchase it in plain wrappers, and these were common in the 18th century into the early 19th century. So we have two examples from the early 19th century here. And they were the paperback of the time. And so especially for pamphlets, for something small, you might leave them bound in this manner, or you would collect your different pamphlets together and later have it bound in a larger book to your taste. Here's an example of the common calf or sheep binding of the 18th century with the raised bands and a gold stamped spine label. Here's an example of an 18th century half leather binding with marbled papers. That was a different aesthetic, to use the marbled papers for the majority of the cover. There's also different leather treatments that could be put on a book. This is an example of a marbled calf or sheep using a water or an acid process to make the dyes run on the cover to make this marble effect. So by the time of the end of the hand binding era, the aesthetic had moved in the 1790s to the 1830s. The aesthetic had moved to what was called sawn-in bands, where instead of those raised cords where the covers were attached to the book block, you had the bands that were hidden, but there was still that desire to show with these gold stripes where the bands would be underneath. So you see these continue into the 1830s. So the earliest publishers' bindings that we'll see next reflect the publisher taking more responsibility for the production of bindings. It is transitional with the hand era during the 1790s to 1820s. Cost-saving materials were used, and this cost-saving material was often plain pasteboard with a printed spine label. Sometimes you saw printed covers. Sometimes books were bound in the early quarter of the 19th century in quarter or full cloth, and trade style and custom leather still persisted. Here's an example of a quarter cloth binding. Early cloth was substandard, not durable, and you don't see a lot of full cloth bindings at this time, 1814. You don't see a lot before, in fact, you don't see a lot before the 1820s in Britain and before the 1830s in the United States. Better cloth was developed specifically for book binding in Britain in 1823, and the British dominated book cloth production throughout the 19th century with some American manufacturers at various times. And this, of course, was due to the sophistication of the British textile industry. Here's an example of a later full cloth binding with a paper spine. There's no decorative tooling or gold stamped on the spine at this time, as we'll see in later examples. The call number below being a later edition. Here's an example of a printed paper spine in a plain board binding. And this looks rather cheap, and it was produced at the minimal of expense by the publisher. They may have still had some idea at this time that this would be a temporary binding, and then people could have it bound to their taste in a more proper leather. Here's a plain printed board with a printed spine label as opposed to the printed spine altogether, just a label on the spine. Here's an example of printed boards. This reflects the publisher putting more effort into a binding. So, and also it provided a marketing device, whereas you see the publisher's advertisement on the back cover advertising other works that they published. And you see these very commonly during this 1790 to 1830 period. You commonly see this on small religious text or school books. Here's another example of a printed binding with the publisher's advertisement on the back. This is a Harrisburg imprint. And here's a Pennsylvania German printed board binding. This is a school lesson book, ABC. So despite these early publishers' bindings we've seen, leather did not go away in the 19th century as a common binding material. It gradually declined as the century moved on, but there were still trade style bindings that could be had either commissioned by the buyer or selected by the bookseller or publisher. These are difficult to differentiate what might have been a custom binding versus a cost-saving publisher's binding. You know, one thing you could think of is better workmanship and decoration could be more indicative of a custom binding. A plainer style perhaps is more indicative of a trade or a publisher's binding, either commissioned by the publisher or the bookseller. The only real way to really differentiate would be to study existing copies of a book, of a title, to see if the same binding was used throughout, or if the same binding is used for part of an edition, or if a leather binding is seen singularly. Here we have an example. We saw this earlier covered in cloth, this encyclopedia. So here we have it in leather. And again, it's difficult to tell. This could be a publisher's leather binding that they commissioned because it's rather simple, you know, not really decorated, not a lot of effort put into it. Or it could have been something that someone had put on or the bookseller had put on. Here's an example. This is most assuredly a publisher's leather with the sophistication of the embossing stamp design on the cover. So publishers' leather like this would be used for better books such as Bibles, or in this case, a history of the world, a pictorial history of the world, kind of a nice coffee table book. Also in the 19th century, publishers' leather could be found on gift books. These were designed to have better printing and better illustrations and better bindings to be given as gifts during the holiday period. And here you see this has chromolithography on the title page, which is an innovation coming in the mid-century. And also, fine binding never went away. So the aesthetic for a fine binding, here's an example of a custom traditional fine binding that replicates 18th century bindings. It's what's called a treed calf or sheep binding, where this decorative effect is put in place using acid to make the dyes, or water to make the dyes run when they're staining the book. So it forms this tree effect, and then they have the gold tooling around the edges. So this is our copy on the left, what ours looks like. And on the right is what the original publisher's binding that had once was on this book, what it looks like. So the publisher, going back to our main discussion on publisher's binding era matured in the 1830s, lasted to about 1930. at least the classic phase of publishers binding. This is not to say that there aren't still publishers bindings. It was characterized by the use of case binding, which was a more assembly line process where the covers were created separately and later applied to the book, not through sewing on with cords, but later applied to the book using a cloth super hinge to glue the binding to the text block. Publishers' bindings used less expensive materials, such as durable dyed cloth, which was made possible through modern aniline dyes. They were not customized. There was one design for the entire edition. This is known as edition binding, and the look of the binding was determined by the publisher. Now, I leave the asterisk there because there are some exceptions, as we'll see later. Publishers' bindings were technologically assisted with dyes or stamping machines and embossing machines for the cloth, as we'll see. And in fact, automation, there was a growing automation throughout the century where a lot of these processes were automated. And as I mentioned before, the hand binding era, this is not to say that these early publishers' bindings weren't done by hand. In fact, but automation did start to creep in and made them more machine made. Publishers' bindings were necessitated in part by the explosion of cheap printed material, with the use of the steam printing press and public demand and the corresponding growth of literacy, leisure time, and disposable income. And the publisher used the binding to market the contents of the book, and we'll see that later. So on the left is a typical publisher's cloth binding from the early 19th century, from about 1840. It's a simple, unadorned cloth except for the ruled borders, creating a panel in the middle. And on the right is a more sophisticated, mature publisher's binding from 1907 that uses color inks, more vibrantly colored cloth, gold stamp representation of the contents of the book. So publishers' cloth bindings, which is the meat of 19th century publishers' bindings, are characterized by the use of embossed or textured cloth, a durable color cloth, blind or gold stamp decoration, and they're decorated or pictorial in nature. And blind stamping means that the designs are pressed in without the use of gold. So you just see the impression is the design, and gold is where you apply gold at the same time. So the gold's pressed into the covers. Here's an example of the embossing, image of the embossing machine. These were engraved cylinders, both a positive and a negative. And so publishers would create textures or grains on cloth using a calendaring process, applying heat and pressure. As we'll see in the following examples, book cloth was diverse and experimental in the 1830s through the 1860s. And there were a large variety of cloth grains that later became more homogeneous. In fact, manufacturers of the period and modern scholars have identified over 200 distinct grains or textures of book cloth. There's not universal agreement on terms, so some of the following identifications could be argued. Some scholarship indicates the approximate dates of the adoption of these grains based on extant examples. First one seen here is kind of a net grain. And I should also point out, take a look at these as we're looking at the grains, take a look at the colors of the book cloth. Some of them have been impacted through oxidation or fading, but you can get an idea in this case on the image on the right of the original color of this book cloth. Here's an example of a honeycomb grain. This is a dot grain and a crisscross grain. And if you notice, these are both the same book. So this is an example of, even though theoretically, it would all be uniform as a publisher's binding, depending on the capacity of who they were outsourcing binding to, who they were subcontracting to. They may have different availabilities of cloth on hand. So this is an example of variation within an edition, but still nevertheless publisher's book cloth. And here's the pebble grain, the ribbon grain, the floral textured grain. You can see this has spine label on it. The floral smooth grain, abstract textured grain, geometric textured grain, ribbed grain. This is a diaper grain, the wave grain, and the moire grain. So moire is considered one of the first book cloth patterns, and this is based on the use of silk and the British experience, the British textile industry's experience with producing silk. So this was a kind of a silk aesthetic that's added. That's the moire grain that's added to this publisher's cloth. And this originated about 1829 or so, considered one of the first grains. And then the Morocco grain, even though this example is outside our time frame, it's nevertheless represents what was available, the look of Morocco grain in the 19th century. And Morocco is an imitation of goat skin, a leather binding. And this was, between this and moire, they're the first, considered the first. And then here's a leather imitation grain. And then moving on to, in addition to grains embossed on the cloth before binding, cloth was also decorated with blind stamps produced by dies pressed onto the boards after binding to add additional designs to book cloth. And as I mentioned earlier, blind means it's stamped without the gold being pressed in along with it. However, with this blind stamp binding, the title of the book is stamped in gold on the spine. So that was very common. So this is kind of a classic Victorian, kind of like a cameo, the oval. Here's an oval design in these boards. And in fact, this design for this cover was consistently used throughout this Young Americans library by the publisher Lindsay and Blakiston of Philadelphia, because we have other copies in our collection on other Revolutionary War era personages using the same binding. Here's an example of the panel style with the ruled frame around it, a little bit of decoration between the two lines, and then a panel in the middle. Here's an example of a panel binding with more decoration in the middle of it, blind stamped in. Here's an example of a binder stamp, the Middlebrook Bindery, New York. So this documents who the publisher had bind these books for them. And then we move on to what I call blind stamp pictorial, where instead of just a design, we also have the starting of the indication of the contents of the book inside with the use of vignettes or little images. So this book's about a Civil War regiment. And so you see the eagle, the military flags, and I think some weaponry at the base of the eagle. Here's an example of the jolly motif from Indo-Islamic or Mughal architecture in India. So this represents the contents of the book is about India. Here's an example of the use of the quatrefoil, a Christian Gothic symbol, to represent the topic of this book inside on Christian theism. And also it has the publisher's name stamped in the middle of the cover, so you really can't get a better publisher's binding than this. Here's an example of publisher's monogram placed in the center of this book, Carrying Heart. Here's an example of the use of the title being stamped on the cover rather than on the spine. Here's an example. It has an image representing a cotton spinning machine on the cover, and another part of that same machine or another piece of machinery on the spine with the title stamped in gold on the spine. Here's an example of a metaphorical suggestion of the contents of the book. You reap what you sow, with the harvest basket of fruit in this Conduct of Life book. There's another example. Then here's an example of combining the two, where you see the title stamped in gold along with a pictorial image representing the contents of the book. And here you see a gold stamp pictorial image and the title, The Stranger in Philadelphia. This is a Philadelphia guidebook, and this is a representation of Girard College on the cover, which is probably based from a period print. So we saw printed paper bindings earlier, and here we see a continuation of that, but in a much more sophisticated manner. So the printing quality of this in two colors is better, and this may reflect that this publisher, John Weck, was from Germany, so he may have brought German methods, German technology to Philadelphia during this time. Here's an example of a full pictorial chromolithograph printed paper on pasteboard. And this presages the later developments. This is a full color as opposed to just in one color in gold, or as opposed to being blind stamped. So publishers' illustrated bindings. We just looked at early bindings shaped by technological capabilities and techniques such as embossing, blind stamping, gold stamping, and the growth of pictorial representations of the contents of the book on the cover. Now we'll look at distinct styles and design elements influenced by art taste and art movements, and culminating in the development of a more fully pictorial style after the Civil War to market the contents of a book. These publishers' illustrated bindings, as opposed to kind of a decorated publisher's binding or a publisher's binding, these illustrated bindings are characterized by a style evolution to even more pictorial or representative of the contents of the book. There's an evolution, it sees an evolution from tradesman designed to artist design, correlating with the growth of the golden age of illustration in the 1870s to 1890s. In fact, as I showed earlier, a lot of those earlier books were kind of they were informed or characterized by the use of technology, of craftsmanship and what technologies were available. They were driven by that, but then they became driven more by the artists themselves and what they wanted to convey about the contents of the book, or what was eye-catching to get a reader's attention to buy the book. And so publishers' illustrated bindings, as we'll see next, there are some distinct styles at various times. Here's an example, and this overlaps, of course, with the technological developments. Here's the neoclassical style with Greek and Roman imagery. And here's an example, it's more subdued with the Greek key design around the edges. Books during the Civil War period were not highly adorned. Here's an example of the Rococo Revival period, kind of your classic Victorian look with the frilly designs. There's another Rococo Revival. This is a gift book, and this is in a Morocco grain. And even though it's leather, it's debatable whether this is true goat skin or if this is another leather, less expensive leather that's been treated to look like Morocco. By the 1870s, there are some stylistic components prevalent, different stylistic components of some of those styles we saw earlier. This is not to say that earlier characteristics can't be seen in some examples from this decade. So we see here in the 1870s, the use of asymmetry, use of a diagonal axes in a lot of the designs, use of thin lines, gold stamping, black inks, more vibrant colored cloth. In fact, we do see a trend toward homogenization of book cloth into a less embossed, more smooth texture as we move from emphasizing kind of the technological capabilities of producing book cloth and stamping it to more pictorial images. So these are more flat, more planar, or whatever word you'd use for that. These are more flat than pressed into the book, as was the case in earlier examples. So here's Charles Eastlake inspired. Charles Eastlake's hints on household taste in furniture, upholstery, and other details greatly influenced decorative arts of the period, and that carried through into books during the 1870s and 80s, his 1868 book. So here we see the use of ruled frames, intersecting lines, furniture or architectural designs, and abstract geometrical designs. By the 1880s, there's still some holdover Eastlake influence. We still see abstract geometrical designs, gold stamping, black inks. Then we see organic natural designs. And then you start to see the appearance of other colors. I don't have any examples from the 1880s, but we'll see some later. '80s. By the 1890s, more color inks were used as seen in this example. This design reflects the arts and crafts movement in the United States. The organic elements in medieval designs seen during this period are an attempt to harken back towards the pre-industrial era and pre-industrial craftsmanship. That was part of the arts and crafts movement, a rejection of the cold industrialism of the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the United States in the 18th and early 19th centuries. So they're trying to emulate a little more traditional medieval handcrafted materials. The Art Nouveau movement in the 1890s and 1900s use stylized elements. In this case, we have peacock feathers that are stylized. And this example's printed in silver, actually an imitation silver. This was an innovation using palladium and aluminum because silver would have tarnished, and it was not possible until this time to use silver as a decoration. There's another nice example of an Art Nouveau inspired book. This is by Margaret Armstrong, a professional artist. And again, this represents the move away from tradesman design to professional artist and more the aesthetics over the technical techniques. And this corresponds with the golden age of illustration, as I mentioned earlier. By the 1890s, you started to see photography, the technology to use photography in print. So that starts to eventually supplant illustration as a pictorial form. There's another example of an Art Nouveau book. This has the initials of Marion L. Peabody in the corner. You see in the lower right-hand corner. Also, besides continuing designs based on fine decorative art movements, there was a move towards an aesthetic for representing different cultures. There's a fascination with Asian art because of the opening up of Japan in 1859. So this is called Japanisma, or English, I guess it would just be Japanism. This is representative of Japanese painting. Here's another example using the chrysanthemum that was emblematic in Japanese art. This is chinoiserie. This uses a motif representing Chinese enamelware or cloisonne. Orientalism. This term represents a Western-centric view of the exotic, perhaps with related cultural stereotypes and tropes. This shows Indian architecture, mannerisms, dress, the Asian elephant. This book shows medieval Moorish architecture in Spain. The poster era, the next art movement that highly influenced publishers' bindings, 1890s and 1920, used printed, not stamped designs, were more representational, less stylized, and used more color and less gold, if any gold at all. And these are more flat. These aren't pressed in. These are printed onto the cloth. Another example. So the last era before the advent of the dust jacket was the Art Deco era. So this example shows kind of the movement that was inherent in Art Deco art with the tall ceiling and the archway here. Think of the Chrysler building and it's soaring skyward. And that has this decidedly Art Deco style overhead light. Now there was a transitional period before we get to dust jackets where they used pasted down pictorial illustrations, and these were printed and pasted on the cover. And at the same time, there were more highly colorful and decorated end papers. So you see this for a short period during the 19 teens, 1920s. So the end of the publisher's binding era, the golden age, is the dust jacket. The dust jacket was money saving. It's a similar idea as the publisher's illustrated bindings. It was used to market the contents of the book with a colorful presentation, but it had a plain generic binding underneath and was rather ephemeral since they were easily destroyed or lost or torn. There's an example of the dust jacket with the plain nondescript publisher's binding on the right. So why are publishers' bindings important? They help teach students about visual literacy. A picture tells 1,000 words. So there's different symbolism and values that are represented and what's represented on the covers of the book. They're useful for studying the history of art. You know, things don't exist in a vacuum. What was going on in the art world and commercial art influenced what was put on covers of books. They help with studies of material culture. The book is a cultural artifact and all it represents in literacy and consumerism, using the book to represent your intellect by having all those on display in a library in your house. Cultural and social history, what are the topics of the book and how do they see those topics as reflected in what they put on the bindings. And also, we also saw that they're important for printing and publishing history and the history of technology, communications technology. But publishers' bindings, unfortunately, are at risk due to rebinding, poor repair, weeding. A lot of pre-1923 bindings have unfortunately been lost in favor of using a digitized surrogate. They're sometimes lost through neglect or a lack of recognition of their significance. And they also suffer from library markings. You may have seen some of our copies have library markings. And this, of course, is because these books were originally purchased for the contents and were in circulating collections. But we've identified ones that have aesthetic properties and are representative of the publisher's binding era and have brought them into special collections for their artifactual value to preserve them. For additional study, these websites are very useful. They give identification guides to grains, historical context, databases of other examples. So thank you for attending. That's all I have. If you have any questions, have any items to donate, you can contact me at this address. And then I think we can open it up for questions, and I'll leave this up so you can get those links.
Thank you, Michael. We do have a few questions here in the chat. Let's see. Okay. Were the publisher's bindings more costly? Were people buying them more for display or for collecting?
So at the time, they probably weren't purchased for collecting, because the wealthy, like J.P. Morgan, they were collecting 18th century or older items, so they were more for the utility of reading them. And yeah, that's unfortunately shows that our collection, of course, wasn't collected for the books for the bindings themselves, but for the reading.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other, could you read the other part of that again?
Were people putting them on display, or, I was just wondering if there were other versions of them that weren't so elaborately designed.
Well, I mean, they'd be on display in that, if you value them as part of your library,
Mm-hmm.
but they weren't for like a user library. You certainly would have them on display with the rest of your books, but
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that the big collectors of the best from all time would be collecting them, because of course they're contemporary and too new, and they would probably consider them cheap because they're in cloth rather than leather. And so I think in that sense.
Excellent.
Yeah. And then I think there was a part of that was about expense. So generally they were less expensive because of the mass production. They would have gotten less expensive through mass production. So these were consumer culture, kind of the first more accessible to everyone consumer culture, as people had more disposable income in the 19th century.
Excellent. B. Telford, who is one of our guests today, works for the U.S. government publishing office in Washington, D.C. And she says, or he says, that we still bind and marble by hand. So that's pretty cool. Were the people who designed the covers considered artists, or was it more of a trade?
Early on, it was more of a trade, because there isn't really documentation of an artist. The early 19th century artists weren't really involved in that, and later ones were, and that kind of corresponds with the technological developments of color printing and everything. So you would have these commercial artists that did illustrations for magazine articles or did World War I posters. They may be involved in bookbinding design, because that's part of commercial art at the time. But early on, it was more of a tradesman who had the craftsman technique to do these blind stamps, but otherwise didn't really have artistic training.
Amy asks, were harmful materials used in the older bindings? Are there precautions you should take while handling them?
Yeah, there was arsenic that was used for some of that the brighter green colors.
Mm.
And so that could leach out, especially if they were wet. And so, yeah, it wouldn't, and there were probably other things like lead used. So it would always be a good idea to wash your hands and don't eat it while you're, and that's a good idea anyway from a preservation standpoint. But you wouldn't want to handle, 19th century bindings of unknown materials and then eat afterwards without washing your hands. And arsenic is what we know to be the more harmful, but I don't know that you get poisoned from handling one on occasion.
Mm.
But the brighter the green, kind of the more of a flag that is that it might have arsenic in it.
Mhm. Okay, John has a comment. I'm under the impression that even houses of lower social status in the Victorian era had a center table in the parlor, and on that table would be displayed items, typically a Bible, maybe something like the Life of Christ. And often, if the family wanted to appear to be educated and sophisticated, they might display Irving's Sleepy Hollow or a book of poetry. My grandfather, born in 1888, said that at his home there was a small hanging wall shelf that held maybe 15 or 20 good books that were displayed in the parlor. So that's very interesting too.
Yeah, that's definitely part of the cultural and social history of
Mhm.
the reading public and disposable income and literacy. And of course the Bible, the most printed book. And that, if a family only owned one book, it would be the Bible, of course, and then other books as they could afford them.
Also, the person who talked about the government printing office also noted that they do tours. So after COVID is over, people might want to check out their website and see if they're able to go down for a tour of that. Does anyone else have any further questions?
Will the slides be able to be available to people afterwards?
It can be. We could make that happen somehow.
Okay.
Okay, if they want the slides, they can either email me or if they want to email you, Michael, and we can just send those out.
Okay. mlear@pa.gov.
Mm-hmm. And then Jesse Noonan posted a link if everybody has information about or questions about dangerous substances, I'm sorry, in books. There is a link there from Jesse Noonan about what substances were used in the creation of books. So please check that out.
Yeah, Jesse's been looking at our collection to see if we can identify arsenic covers, maybe to just to flag them, to be careful with them, or largely for the informational value, because it's always neat to show somebody something. Say, look, this book has arsenic in it. It's dangerous.
Well, thank you, Michael, for this fascinating talk and showing off all of the beautiful bindings. Thank you to all our guests for joining us today. Please stay tuned for our next session, which will be in April or May, about the 18th century book in America, from British imports to American printed works, and the role of the printer, bookbinder, and bookseller, as well as technology and production methods with examples from the State Library's collections. The event specifics will be posted on PA State Employees Bulletin Board, the Visit PA website, and also our website, which is www.statelibrarypa.gov. And if you have further questions about the program, please feel free to contact any of us via the website. Thank you again, Michael, and have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.